Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining the Wisconsin ACEDS chapter meeting for May 2021. I'm thrilled to have Kat Casey, the Chief Information Officer at Disco, CS Disco. Are you CS Disco or Disco now?
Just Disco.
Just Disco. Perfect. There it is. And Sarah Paisley, who I'm going to let do the majority of the introduction today. But before we get started, just a couple of quick housekeeping items. Next month's meeting is going to be managing remote review beyond the pandemic. So you will get an invitation to that, hopefully sooner than later. Sorry about the late notice on this one. We had a couple of challenges getting the information back and forth with ACEDS National. So we'll work on continuing to strive to do that better and give you a little more notice going forward. Also, let's see, what was the other? Oh, we're contemplating an in-person meeting sometime in the fall, and we're interested in what we will be sending out a survey to all of our members to find out what your interest level is, what your concerns are, if you have any concerns regarding the pandemic, or if you would prefer to continue doing Zoom meetings. So that is to come, but that's really all the housekeeping I have at this point. So I would like to, it's my pleasure to introduce Kat Casey and Sarah Paisley. And Sarah, would you like to do the honors?
I will. Yeah. Thanks for the introduction, Kat. Kat with a K. And I'm thrilled to be here with this group, looking around at the names. Some of you all I know, some of you I'm looking forward to getting to know. I'm your regional sales exec over Wisconsin with Disco. If you're familiar with us, we're a legal technology, cloud-based legal technology and services company. So, and really the reason we're all here today is to hear from Kat Casey, who I have the privilege to introduce right now. She is our Chief Innovation Officer with Disco, came to Disco with over 15 years of experience in the legal technology and e-discovery space, is a true thought leader in this area. She's a great person to follow on LinkedIn. She's constantly churning out really insightful blogs and even some TikTok content. She keeps things really engaging. Prior to Disco, she was the global lead of e-discovery for Gibson Dunn. And then before that, was with a few consultancies in the space. So I think she's going to lead a really engaging conversation today. I will be keeping an eye on the questions box. If anyone has any questions, feel free to type them in there, and I'll make sure that Kat sees them and addresses them. But I think this will be a great conversation, definitely really timely, given the world we're all living in. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kat.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and welcome to this new chapter of ACEDS in Wisconsin. So today we're going to talk about this kind of seismic shift that's occurred in how people communicate and what that means for legal practitioners that are looking to wrap their arms around all these new ways people are communicating and find key evidence. So what the heck is an apocalypse? What am I talking about? Why are we talking about it, and what caused it? So to my mind, the language of business and personal life today is data, and it spans a myriad of sources. And as legal practitioners, everything from applications like Slack to, all sorts of apps to communicate on my iPhone, from Signal to Telegram to WhatsApp to SMS to Facebook Messenger, all of these different types of pieces of information are part of the entire ecosystem you've got to track down as you're trying to figure out, what the heck did this custodian do? Am I going to have to go deal with a regulator? Or, hey, what's my case strategy when I'm going up against the opposing counsel? So let's take a step back. Obviously, discovery is not a new thing, but e-discovery is relatively new. And if you're on here with ACEDS, then I'm preaching to the choir in terms of, in 2006, we had the amendments to the federal rules, and suddenly the E came into play, electronically stored information. And there's been this kind of cataclysmic shift in terms of the volume of data that we're making in the quintillions. And I don't even know how many zeros that is, but I think it's like halfway stacked to the moon, both in terms of stuff that our systems make automatically and stuff that we as humans make. And in the context of Ediscovery, we're primarily focused on human created data, unstructured data. And that's everything from, like I said, those text messages to post on Facebook to, yes, even kitty cat memes and that poor man who got a cat filter stuck on his face. And bear with me, there's going to be cat references throughout because my name's Cat. And so for the Ediscovery space, this unstructured data, it started out as email, started out as documents. And we kind of created this entire universe and process of Ediscovery with, paper in mind, with banker boxes in mind, with file cabinets in mind. But today, data is fundamentally different. And the places and the volume of information that we're creating is at times overwhelming. I mean, thankfully, there's technology to help with it, but the first step is to even begin scoping that information into your e-discovery process. If you don't ask a custodian, hey, do you have Slack or Teams data? Or hey, do you have chat messages from a Zoom conversation? Or hey, do you have any applications that you're using to communicate with each other? Then you're not going to have this key information. And it doesn't just stop at the applications. Things are smart now. We've had a whole plethora of cases where I think there was a murder that had pivotal evidence in a smart water pump because someone drained and refilled a hot tub at 3 a.m, even though they claimed that they had not done so and most certainly had not killed someone in said hot tub. There's also been cases of a large insurance provider that gave Fitbits to all their employees only to find out that, hey, did you know that the heart rate follows a very specific pattern of spiking or dipping depending on what illicit substance a person is using? And oh my goodness, what do I do when members of the C-suite are using meth? And oh my goodness, do I have to modify my policy to include that in their employment evaluation? So these smart devices, they're not in that unstructured piece because a lot of this is being automatically created by a machine, and it's starting to work its way into Ediscovery. And so it's something worth considering depending on the type of case that you're dealing with. Stuff where it's got supply chain logistics might mean there's, the black boxes in a truck. Stuff where there's specific, biomedical devices in terms of tracking someone or geolocation. You might want to consider this information. John McAfee ended up being on a manhunt for Lord knows what, being crazy, and was caught because of the geolocation on a picture that got posted on Twitter. So there's this whole new ecosystem and universe of data that can have really impactful information. In particular, I'm really focused on this explosion of applications. Ever since the introduction of the iTunes Store and the iPhone, suddenly there's been this entire universe of developers that are making really great tech, mainly for commercial, individual, retail, personal use at first. But what's happened is people got used to iPhone easy and started to expect that in their work applications. And so suddenly you had this explosion of shadow IT or IT sort of outside of the confines of a traditional IT structure. What does that mean? Even if your company says, hey, don't talk about business on Facebook, that doesn't necessarily mean that someone's not using Facebook Messenger or another application like ephemeral messaging, self-destructing messaging like Telegram or Signal, or maybe even Slack for a collaboration tool. Doesn't mean people aren't using these more user-friendly tools to be more effective. And big picture, what does that mean? It means even if your organization hasn't quite caught up to having a policy around how you handle this data, that doesn't mean that your client or your organization, if you're in-house, doesn't have to consider the impact of this data on retention, on uncovering key evidence, and even on potential risk. Now, BYOD is a really interesting thing in the App-ocalypse, and it's really accelerated obviously since the pandemic. These stats are actually pre-pandemic, but you're looking at upwards of 80% of employees using their cell phone for mobile email. And there's a vast increase that we've seen of people using personal devices. My iPad, my personal, laptop, my cell phone, after hours and even in business hours to do business type things. This exposes some extra considerations around potential risk depending on what sort of program that you have. Is it like, did someone buy their own phone and then, you just said, hey, you can download Mobile Iron and we're going to manage the phone in terms of, our business communication? Is it just someone's personal phone? Is it a company-owned phone? So you really want to understand from a risk and exposure standpoint, what sort of policies in place and what sort of devices might be in scope. If you've got a company with a couple hundred people, there's a whole world of difference of, paying $500 a phone for 100 people, as opposed to $500 for 2 phones, an iPad, a laptop, and a personal laptop for a person. So understanding what the scope of a collection is really important, as well as understanding to what extent people are commingling their business communication on these personal and private apps. And there's a bunch of different regulations and privacy concerns that, as we as practitioners look at these devices, are coming into play. Everything from, the increase of privacy regulations in the states, like the Washington Data Privacy Act or CCPA, as well as the, 800-pound gorilla GDPR. These are all going to come into play in terms of having access to this data that's on personal devices, as well as just potential risk in terms of a breach. And there's obviously a ton of risk. There are some ways that you can kind of keep your side of the street clean. I'm not going to dig too much into this because, again, this is more about, what do I do with the evidence? But it's just good to be aware of. There's this extra layer of risk and exposure. And I think that the adoption rate of BYOD is actually accelerating the adoption rate of a lot of these newer and emerging communication methodologies. Think like Clubhouse, where people can just go in a room and talk about whatever they want and anyone can record it. Slack and Teams in terms of collaboration. All these different types of communication for international tools as well. So WeChat, if you've got any sort of APAC colleagues or a multinational with Asian offices or outposts, as well as WhatsApp for a lot of the international colleagues. And you may find that you've got people like myself who have all of the above. I've got colleagues that are all over the world. And so I, have group chats. Let me take a step back. Just this morning, I woke up and then I looked at my phone and I responded to some of my Brazilian colleagues and friends on WhatsApp. Then I looked at LinkedIn and I had some communication there, both in their LinkedIn Messenger and in the posting. Went to Facebook, actually then took a step back, went and looked at my Slack channels. That then told me, oh, there's a document I want to look at in my cloud-based Google Drive. Then I checked a voicemail. Then I looked at an email. Then I got up and showered. That was all in the first 30 or 45 minutes of my day. And so there's a lot more potential ways that people are communicating. If you wanted to know what Kat, the custodian, did, I would never get myself in trouble, but say I did, say I had some sort of government investigation. If you just kind of took your traditional approach of, I'm going to look for shared drives, email, documents, and Excel, you might miss out that conversation I had with my teammate in Brazil, or the collaboration I'm doing on documents via Slack in Google Drive. And the interesting thing is, because these newer applications, a lot of them are in your mobile phone, or they're a little more informal, people, they kind of tend to air their dirty laundry a little bit more in them. And so it's not only that you might miss the continuity of a communication, you might miss the, needle in a haystack smoking gun type information, because there's shorter format, more informality, and sometimes more candor in a lot of these tools. And so I would look at kind of a couple broad categories. You don't want to have to boil the ocean. You always start by asking people how they're communicating. But a couple areas I'd look at would be obviously email and documents, clear. Social media, depending on what you're looking for. Is it a public figure? Are you dealing with an organization that's maybe having some regulatory concerns about how they're marketing something like Juul? Or is it something, perhaps it's more of a personal injury thing? Maybe it's a class action. Is someone posting, or is it a group of individuals posting about, how active they're being when they're claiming they're, incapacitated? The mobile apps are interesting too. Like you can't just say, oh, I'm going to just, take some screenshots on the phone. It could be anything from, the call logs to the text messages to individual applications to geolocation. There's a whole universe. In that application space, there's also a subcategory, ephemeral messaging or self-destructing messaging. That's gained a lot of traction in the last 18 months to 2 years. And there are unique challenges there in terms of capturing the data and even knowing to look there. Internet of Things, like I talked about earlier, devices, smart stuff is creating a whole big universe. And then obviously Zoom. We're sitting here now. I'm sure there are people that are in the chat now that are talking. There's this whole new ecosystem. And so as we expand our communication methodology, it's really important to begin incorporating this into how you scope your ESI. What's your custodial questionnaire have? Does it talk about these things? Does it ask people, how are you communicating? I would also say, because there's this whole new ecosystem of communication, it becomes even more critically important to ask people in the groups that are relevant to your potential matter. So not just, I'm going to talk to the CIO and the GC, but hey, if you're dealing with an engineering department, maybe talk with them and figure out, hey, are you using OneDrive or Google to share your documents? You've got a team in India. Are they using WhatsApp, or are you guys mostly using standard email? So you want to make sure you're asking about these types of information to a broader group of people. And where you look for this information varies depending on a lot of different factors. Again, it's a little more complicated than, hey, I'm just going to go, download data from a shared drive. Some of these applications are in the cloud, which means maybe you're going to be pulling data from AWS or Azure. Some of it's going to be physically stored on a device, whether it's a mobile phone or a iPad, or actually on a laptop. Some of it's going to require getting access to a password. So you want to kind of understand where in the physical ecosystem this data potentially lies. And there's another complication. I feel like I'm telling you all the bad, but I'll get you to some of the good soon. Some of this data is really ugly. The stuff on the right side of your screen is a native JSON file. This is what Slack data looks like if you just kind of plop it in a tool. So on the left is what it looks like in Disco. What you want to do is make sure if you're dealing with some of this newer, weird data, that you understand what it's going to look like when people are reviewing it. I mean, Ediscovery is expensive, but the tech side's only 20% of the cost, reviews 80% of the cost. And so if you're looking at something like the gobbledygook on the right, which I can't make head or tail of, and I dig into the stuff and enjoy it, that's going to be a slow moving to potentially just grind to a halt review. Whereas on the left, you've got context, who spoke, you'll get the GIFs, you'll get the emojis. And it's not just JSON file. Some of it's about evolving how you even think about a data source. So take Zoom. It's got audio, it's got video, it's got the chat log, and it's got the ability to add links in the chat log, both to cloud-based data repositories, external links, you can add GIFs, emojis, all of that. And so with the rapid expansion of basically everyone and their mother adopting either Zoom or Teams or some other technology, it's important to factor that into your workflow. So you're not just thinking, hey, I'm just gonna, pretend the Zoom didn't happen, because if someone, like in this case, is recording it, could be discoverable, and the chat information is retained.
Kat, we have a question.
Dive in.
Bennett. He is wondering if there is a checklist other than the great list you put together of different apps to ask for when maybe some partners aren't necessarily thinking ahead of people using these things for nefarious reasons.
I don't know that there's necessarily like a universal checklist, and part of that is just because stuff is developing so quickly. I do have a white paper that will share with the audience after this call that's got a kind of a breakdown of the different categories and some questions to ask. And I'm in flight on building out a custodial questionnaire that kind of encapsulates this universe. The key thing to do might be to ask, hey, how do you communicate? Do you use anything outside of the standard company approved information? Will people always be forthcoming? No, but you might be surprised. Were there any, I see 3 buttons on the chat. Were there any other questions before I dive back in?
One question, if we'll be allowed to get a copy of the presentation, which I believe we will be sending around. So yes to that.
Absolutely. We'll send the presentation and the PDF of the white paper, which is also called, I think, Surviving the App-ocalypse. So another thing that's really important, kind of in the same vein as the Zoom and the kind of thinking about Slack, is, believe it or not, text messages. We've been adding them to Discovery for a long time, but some of the more legacy approaches basically were big, nasty behemoths of a spreadsheet that took forever to review and didn't build any context, or in some cases, people will kind of weirdly break up the text messages. So again, it's important to have a platform that's going to help you visualize the data in as close to the way that the original user made it as possible. Helps with context, helps with kind of understanding what someone was trying to say a lot more than having like the coding structure for the smiley face emoji. And so my advice in any case is, if you haven't dealt with this vendor, whoever it is, before with this data type, ask for an example. They should have something, whether it's a GIF or a screenshot or something, just so you understand what it's going to look like. I had a case years ago where I was told up, down, and sideways, oh yeah, we're absolutely, we're great with mobile data. And they were fast, but what I got took 5 times as long to review, and it ended up blowing my budget up. And continue asking that. New platforms are blowing up all the time. TikTok, which I recently discovered and both love and hate, may ultimately become a major source of advertising revenue with large corporations on it. It's already sort of happened, which means potentially discoverable, potentially relevant to a case. And again, with this, because it's kind of video, emoji, chat, and short form communication, it's a lot different from a document. You want to make sure whatever platform you're working with can kind of capture it all so you get the context. Now, why does this matter? I touched on it a little bit, but the reality is this new data source, whatever it may be, whether it's short form communication, social media, or ephemeral self-destructing messaging, all of these different ways of communicating could potentially have information really relevant to a case. Whether it's, there's a breach of contract and were people talking about that in Slack, or there's someone that claims that medication previously injured them, and suddenly they're all over social media or TikTok, doing the latest dance move. All of this information can be really relevant, and it's not just one type of case. Almost any type of case could theoretically involve one of these new data types, and so it's really important to ask, because unless you start asking that and kind of make it your go-to, just make it a default to say, oh, is there anywhere else I should look? I think of it like back in the day, if you've been doing this as long as I have, you wouldn't just go to the president of a company and say, where do you, 15 years ago, where did you file all your stuff, right? You'd go and ask, maybe his receptionist, maybe other people in the group, and ask them, where else might information have been squirreled away? It's not that different here. Yes, there's technical considerations, but you're still just trying to uncover where else might the juicy bits be, for lack of a better way to describe it. So how do we begin? Where do we get started? I've kind of painted a picture of, wow, that's complicated and a little scary. Start by asking the right people, so people that are in the practice area or group that you're interested in, how they communicate. Ask the engineering team, hey, Uber, are you only communicating in email? The answer is no. They were using Wicker and got in trouble for it because it was self-destructing. But ask people in the team how they're doing it. Not everyone, there will be bad actors, but not everyone is a bad actor. And a lot of times people want to be helpful. And so if you can start by asking the right questions and just remembering to include this information, it can go a long way. In terms of actually getting the data, there are some challenges. Some of these various programs, they've got password protected. A lot of times social media and certainly ephemeral messaging and other communication platforms, they hide behind the Stored Information Act and not necessarily give you information. So you're not going to get a lot of blood from the stone in terms of going to Facebook. You really need to work with the individuals that are involved in a case. And you need to make sure that as you're making these requests for information, judges will give it to you, but you've got to be specific. You can't just say, I want, 10 years of Kat's LinkedIn posts. You need to do the why, you need date range, you need how it relates to the case. You need to prove that you can't find the information in a more easily uncoverable source. And I would suggest if you think that this information source could be relevant, get that legal holdout, get that preservation notice out early, because a lot of these platforms automatically purge after a certain amount of time. They're not going to keep everything forever. And so even if there's no malice or ill intent, there might still be an issue of spoliation. Next, and I touched on this a little bit, where the heck do you look? So if you are dealing with an application on a phone, you could look physically on the device, at an actual account, maybe on a cloud-based sort of software, or you may have to go through and look for an alternative forensic way of collecting data. You need to look a little broader than just shared files, email stores, especially if you start going into that application space. And like I said before, not every one of these new platforms plays nice. There is not a big rush from a program like Signal, which is designed to automatically encrypt and delete communication for privacy, evidently, to then turn over their client's information. So you need to make sure that you're able to, get passwords whenever you can. And from an iPhone standpoint, make sure you get the device password, so the 4 or 6-digit code, their iTunes password, so it'll access a fair number of the apps, and then the individual password and login for any number of the applications that might be relevant. And make sure that you're doing more than just screenshots. We're going to talk a little bit about, how do you get this evidence in, but part of it's authentication, right? So did whoever send the nasty tweet that is, claimed to be from their account? Well, you're going to need maybe an IP address or login information or proof that the account belongs to, a person. Is it Donald J. Trump, or is it Donald J.A.Y. Trump, who probably is not the same person, but tweeting under that username? So you need to verify which person is the accurate person. The other thing you really want to do is be laser focused. I know there's an instinct to say, I want everything in the kitchen sink, but as you get into more and more data sources, be strategic. If you can get the majority of the information you need from 1 or 2 data sources, don't ask for all 10. You're going to want to also make sure that you know what you're looking for to a degree. Sometimes just a pure fishing expedition can be really challenging on something like social media. It's not as readily searchable. I would also say, as judges are a little more concerned about proportionality, just saying, hey, I want it, or I want all of this information, isn't going to be sufficient. Judges will give you access to this evidence, but you've got to have sufficient specificity. Now, as I was hinting at before, when you get into these new communication tools, there's kind of another hurdle, right? I call it the fake news hurdle, right? One, is it reliable? Is this what the person is saying the truth? Because let's be honest, how many people on here actually post, man, I had a really tough day today, shucks, as opposed to the best picture from their most recent vacation? We all kind of tend to craft a story. And so if someone has an injury and you're trying to use a social media post against them based on, being happy and out with family, you might need to make sure that it's not just painting the picture in a bright light. For admissibility, authentication is really key. And so that's why I was saying that just a screenshot may not be enough. The judges are going to want account information if they can have it. Potentially, login or IP address, proof that the account belongs to the person that it's purporting to belong to. It falls under the 901, federal rules of evidence, distinctive characteristics, and it's not a super high hurdle. Judge Grimm's like, if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, we're going to consider it a duck. But it is a requirement. And so I always say err on the side of caution by preserving that key metadata. Anything you can have, maybe it's a phone number that ties the person to an account. Maybe it's, whether or not the, account was logged into by that person. There've been a number of people on social media that have, had a late night post after Ambien or a glass of wine and then said, oh, I was hacked, right? When it comes to evidence, you're going to want to make sure that, the person that is being attributed to the whatever the post is, the communication is the one that did it. And so there's just that little extra level. And it's about ensuring people trust that the evidence you're presenting is authentic and accurate. And there are some ethical and privacy considerations. I mean, when someone is posting some of this information, whether or not they set it to, private versus to the public may matter. Whether it's a direct message to an individual versus a message to 100 million followers may matter. The Stored Information Act in particular, a lot of the bigger discovery providers tend to hide behind, and so you want to really make sure that you have an ironclad reason to ask for the information, that it ties to the issues at stake in a case. You can't just go on a wild fishing expedition and hope you find embarrassing stuff, and then you validate that, yes, this account belongs to this person. No, I can't find that information anywhere else. Personal information, privacy is becoming increasingly a consideration here, and so that again ties into wanting to have that ironclad reason why you need that information, that data source, as something potentially relevant to the case. So we kind of know what we got to do. We know there's a lot of data. You want it. Now what? Well, I mean, it's no surprise. Discovery is big business, but luckily, even though we're seeing this massive growth of data, even though we've got these, needs to look in 12 different places, even though budgets aren't getting any bigger and time constraints are getting tighter, luckily there's been a fair amount of innovation and investment in the e-discovery space. And so there is a kind of a whole new push towards what I like to call augmented intelligence. So if you were to think and look at, in a standard review, data that was in a text message, email, documents, and social media, it's very hard for a human to make correlations across all those data sources, or say it's 100 million documents. Again, very hard for a team of 1 or 1,000 to make those correlations. Luckily, there's this kind of fourth industrial evolution, this move to what I call augmented intelligence, which is, instead of, the robots are going to become robo-lawyers and replace us, robo-paralegals and replace us, it's a shift to, okay, I'm going to be better at my job by using tech. So it'll be technology plus me is a better outcome. Normally I'd ask a poll, but the answer is usually no. At least that's what people think in terms of AI. The reality is it can feel very daunting to talk about AI in general, but if you have a cell phone, you're using it. Do you use Google Maps? The geolocation's AI powered. Do you have a Facebook account? People you may know. Do you go to Amazon to buy dog food and it recommends a dog choice? That's an AI algorithm. All of these different types of technology at our fingertips, Netflix, Amazon, all of it, they're AI powered. The difference between this retail stuff and legal tech is we made a mistake 10 years ago by trying to market AI as complex, scary, only experts can do it, and oh my goodness, it is hard and requires lambda calculus and statistics and precision and recall. And luckily, newer tech like Disco and a few others, we've moved away from that. The reality is, my 3-year-old nephew and my 83-year-old grandfather can both bang around on Netflix in my queue, make recommendations, and they're not going to break my Netflix queue. They're not going to even know they're using AI. We're starting to get that point in legal tech too, where you don't have to do a different workflow. You certainly don't have to be calculus guru who understands F scores and whatever the heck else they were doing. You can just kind of go in and toggle on a button and say, hey, I want to use AI, and you just get better information brought to you. It's just baked in, intuitive, easy to use. And that's kind of the future of legal AI. It's not going to be its own workflow. It's not going to be its own complicated thing. It's just going to be you getting information more quickly to make better decisions. And when you make the decision, having applied more broadly to the data. So I don't think I broke this down, but that kind of the original AI, the idea around it was, let's have machines replace humans. Little Skynet, Terminator, a little creepy, a little dystopian. But in the last several decades, people realized there's stuff humans do better, whether it's critical reasoning, decision making, and there's stuff we don't do great, which is looking at millions of documents and finding patterns, or say, finding some key documents and then, looking at all of the other evidence very, very quickly and saying, oh, I need these 100,000 documents. The newer iterations of tech, that stuff kind of like, the Netflix queue, it learns from decisions you make. And it's a combination of your insights as a legal practitioner and the tech bringing you better information to make better decisions. And it's kind of manifests itself all throughout e-discovery and legal technology. Some of the things I really like are social network analysis. So the system will tell you who's communicating to who with what frequency, key concepts, pulling that out early. I really love, whether you call it TAR or machine learning, but being able to go in on document, 1 to 50, make some coding decisions, and then start having recommendations for similar information that lets you get all the key information really quickly. And there's a whole ecosystem. It's not just legal technology. There's a universe of tech in every aspect of your practice, whether you're doing contracts sort of stuff, looking for anomalies or generating clauses, to looking for, key information, knowledge management sort of stuff, all the way through to even making outcome predictions. Now, like I said before, one of the things I really like is this active learning. Basically, I look at a few documents and I say, relates to my case, privileged, relates to issue B 1 through 7, whatever the case may be. And then the system, after really just a handful of decisions, can suddenly start giving me better stuff, bubbling up the information that I want to look at. So it's not taking decisions away from me. It's just saying, oh, these other documents are kind of like what you've been telling me you want. So I'm going to, move it to the front of the line. And the result is actually pretty compelling. Using prioritization, so not even using the AI to make decisions without you, just having it bubble up key information more quickly, you're getting to the key information in like 20% of the time. And then you can ultimately decide, hey, I don't want to look at the rest. I think it's all fantasy football and garden parties, whatever the case may be. Or you can look at all of it, but just get through it much more quickly. We found that we've got review rates as high as 130 something documents an hour, or 88 on average. But what I like more than the speed is, in the older way of doing it, I wouldn't know if the smoking gun was going to be on, day 1 of review or day 152, right, at midnight before I'm supposed to, create my production file for the opposing side. This helps get you the information more quickly. So even if you decide I want to look at every document, you're still going to have that key information to make fact-driven case decisions more quickly. So what do you do? I feel like I've downloaded a lot. The world's changed. There's all this data, all this new tech. Oh, my hair's on fire. Cats and dogs are playing together. What am I going to do? Couple things. The model rules have come out saying, as a legal practitioner, and yes, it's from the ABA, so it's for lawyers, but I think it applies to anyone in the legal space. There's an expectation of technical competence. Now, before you, log off, run away and say, I refuse to learn to code, I'm just not going to do it, you don't have to. Think of it more like an extension of issue spotting. If you had an antitrust case, would you, as the legal practitioner, try to build out the complex economic models? No, you'd bring in an economist. If you had a deep dive IP case that involved complex biochemical vaccine information, would you try to be the biochemist? No, you'd bring in a biochemist. What I advise people is, when it comes to this ethical duty of technical competence, learn enough, come to stuff like this, to where you can ask the right questions, bring in an expert, and that accounts for those of us that are technologists too. Bring in someone with the niche domain expertise, or at least advise people on the right technology to use. Now, the big question, people are like, okay, great, the tech's wonderful. Do I have to go run for the hills? Are the robo-lawyers coming? Do I have to grab a sign saying we'll litigate for food in a threadbare suit while the lawyers are, robots are in a corner office? No, no need to really be afraid. The reality is, it's not the lawyer robot you have to fear. It's the legal practitioner who's embraced technology. Bob in the office next to you, Susie in the cube down the hall, who use technology to get information to make better decisions more quickly and to get to better results more quickly. Those people are going to leapfrog ahead. I talk a lot about, and I don't think I've mentioned it here yet, but becoming Iron Man. The old idea around technology in general was, the Terminator's coming, run for the hills, the robo-lawyer's coming, run for the hills. I like to think of it more like, hey, it's a little more like Iron Man. That suit he has is great information, super powerful, can't do crap without him in it, right? He's the brain. He is that core, the DNA that then uses that suit, the technology, to make him more powerful. So him plus the tech is light years ahead of just him, but the tech without him can't do a whole lot. And that's the way a lot of this technology is. And I think that even though we have this explosion of data and all these new data sources, it creates more opportunity than it does risk. And I think for legal practitioners in general, attorneys, yes, but I think even more so paralegals, legal technologists, or attorneys that are looking to make a name for themselves. Maybe you're not partner yet, but you're a fourth year and you want to stand out from the crowd. Gaining this technology acumen, understanding these data sources, understanding where to look, what questions to ask, what tech to use, what tech is out there, all of that, I've seen people really, really thrive based on. There was one of the youngest members of the executive committee at Gibson, my old firm, was a young hotshot that just made partner because he understood cybersecurity and he was the kind of the go-to guy on Ediscovery technology. A lot of people are able to accelerate their careers or create more stickiness and relevance in their role, whatever role that is in a firm or an organization, by being I like to call it like the data dork or the tech Sherpa, but helping guide people into this new brave new dataverse apocalypse, whatever you want to call it. So how do you become that, right? I'm going to let you in a secret. I studied existential philosophy and not technology. Not very useful, lots of dead Germans, very grumpy. But I was able to find a niche, start creating a network of people, in the role I wanted, peers that just had insights I didn't have. So they became my web, my sounding board. And then I started coming to things like this often, eventually getting to the point where I was speaking at presentations like this and just devouring on LinkedIn all the different articles and just sort of building up this universe of information, asking a lot of questions. And it didn't take long to become, oh yeah, Kat knows tech, even though Kat didn't code, didn't have a computer science degree, and by all accounts, usually a philosophy major ends up working at Starbucks. But by focusing on that, having that interest, asking questions, and creating that network of people that could create a feedback loop for me, and learning how to translate technology, which is daunting. Let's be honest. Who went to law school or paralegal school because they're like, I love calculus and relational databases? Most of the attorneys I know are like, math, I'll see you later. But by becoming someone who could kind of translate and say, yeah, this seems very complicated, but let me boil it down to a little more simple for you, or vice versa, someone who could who could translate, pardon me, the complex legal issues into a way that technologists understood. So speaking both languages made me really sticky. And so, like I said, find your dorks, find your dork squad. I volunteer to be anyone's dork. And that doesn't have to be a mentor-mentee thing. It could be someone, hey, you just ask a question on LinkedIn, or someone that you follow, you go to their website. If you want a lot of resources, I put up thetechnocat.com. I got a ton of stuff up there. But there's a bunch of people. Debbie Reynolds does a lot of stuff around privacy. Colin Levy does a lot of stuff around, being a legal technologist. Obviously, ACEDS is a massive wealth of information, and a ton of people contribute there. And read the rags. And I don't mean just blog, legal tech news and above the law, but read the blogs that come out on ACEDS, EDRM, whatever the case may be. And also, I would follow anyone who writes an interesting blog that you like on LinkedIn. And don't be afraid to ask questions. Chime into the comments. People want to help. Get certified. Both the ACEDS traditional and their technology certification. I was part of the pilot group like 14 years ago, and that helped give me credibility as someone who knew tech, even as I was still getting my sea legs. I'll be honest, the test is a little bit harder now, but it's something that I think is really impactful. And then stay curious. Keep digging in and looking at all those questions and trying to figure out, what the heck is going on and where might the next interesting, challenging, fascinating issue pop up. And I don't know if there's any questions. I saw a couple pop up, but this is kind of, I'll take a breath and see if if Sarah, if you had anything else that anyone wanted to ask before I keep talking.
Elaine commented that she loved your slide with the tips and the key, and I agree. That's really solid practical advice and something that can feel a little daunting.
Don't start boiling the ocean. Like it starts pretty small, honestly, and don't go it alone. Like I have a good friend of mine used to do a discovery over at Walmart, said he always has, 3 go-to people in his spider web, his network of brains, right? Someone doing what he wants to do in 5 years, someone doing what he's doing now, but maybe differently, better, or in an interesting way, and someone where he was a couple years ago. And he likes to use all 3 as a sounding board and learn from them. Sometimes it'll be the more junior person that's like, hey, have you heard about Clubhouse? Or, hey, what about blockchain and cryptocurrency? Is there anything I need to know about there? And then the person, your peer, might just be facing the issues you're facing, but in a different way. And of course, the person where you want to be, Operation World Domination, why don't you want to pick their brain? Let's see if anything else popped up.
William has a question. Is he able, William, I think if you can come off mute.
Yeah, feel free to chime in, anyone.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Hi, guys. Fantastic, Kat. Been a big fan. Watching from South Africa here. The reality in South Africa is that we're actually 15 years behind on Ediscovery. It's something we haven't even considered in our courts here. And it's something that's kind of coming quite new into the market this side. So there's a lot of books coming out and stuff. But I think the biggest sort of challenge we're going to have here is how long it will take for the courts here to accept Ediscovery. Just out of curiosity, how long did it take for that process to get through the American system? Was it quite a complicated process? Was it a long thing, or did they just kind of accept it straight away? Because I can just see a lot of complications this side of the world.
It was accepted, and I think it helped that our federal rules, which all the courts are guided by, were amended to include explicitly electronically stored information in 2016, which was honestly, in terms of the adoption of email, pretty early. There was and still is an education gap, though, depending what district you're in, depending what court you're talking to. There's some gurus like Judge Peck, he's retired now, and Judge Grimm. They know tech really well and they'll ask some deep questions. But if you have someone who maybe went to law school before, when people were still using a stone tablet as opposed to a laptop, there's a learning curve. What I would do, honestly, is look to your UK counterparts. So they were a little later to the game. They're a couple years behind the US, and they also have probably a similar idea about personal data versus company-owned data. They were actually able to leapfrog ahead into embracing some of the tech because it protected privacy, and you were able to kind of explain to the court, this information is super relevant, but I'm taking these safeguards by using tech to protect people's privacy. Because the hesitation for, at least for the UK, was, do I have the right to take that data? Should I be looking at my employees' data? And whatever the case may be. It'll be a process, but I think you'll be pleasantly surprised that, once you kind of have a larger number of cases, suddenly the judges want to learn more and are more willing, if that makes sense.
It does. Thanks very much.
I don't know if anyone else has a question. I saw some pop up, but I'm not.
Kat, I'll read you a question from Peter in the box. With technology and apps changing almost every minute, will some forward-thinking companies or firms almost have a job scouring the World Wide Web or anything else for these new technologies, or will most people just always be a little bit behind?
I mean, I wish, it'd be awesome if there was someone that could just say, here is the spreadsheet. It's going to update every 37.5 minutes because there's something like 1,300 new apps a year. It's crazy. The reality is that's a little harder, but I would say you don't have to worry about every single application out there way, way down the line, but you've got to start worrying about the ones that have a larger number of adoptees, right? So Slack has, 30 something million users. Teams has 75 or 100 million users. You're in the billions for the Facebook ecosystem, which is Instagram, Facebook Messenger, and WhatsApp. And over 1 billion for WeChat, and text messages, obviously everyone. So these are big volumes. There should be a lot of articles and case law about it. So I would focus more on making sure you've got the big 10, 5 or 10, if you will, the social media giants. Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, maybe, Twitter, LinkedIn, right? And then from the messaging side, obviously Messenger, because it's part of Facebook, WhatsApp, if you're dealing with Europeans, WeChat, if it's dealing with Asia. There are the ephemeral messaging ones. They're a little harder to get. So maybe have that be a second tier, those self-destructing messages, Signal, Telegram, Wickr. But those are kind of the universe I would really think of. And then Zoom, again, we're talking in the hundreds of millions of people. Teams, hundreds of millions of people. So these platforms, they're high enough profile that should help. I worry less about kind of like Pokemon, got to catch them all. It's less about that than got to make sure I've CYA'd for the Big 10.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think to that point, like if you're following your 4 tips of advice here, you're probably going to be up to date, you know, with most users. Just odds are if you're having those conversations. So this is great.
Ask people, honestly, like if I am your data dork, be like, hey, Kat, where should I be looking for evidence? And I'm like, oh, well, here's the 5 articles I wrote. I think it's helpful. Is it everything? No, but it's a starting point. No one expects perfection, especially because things move so quickly. So as long as you kind of stay curious and make a best effort, I think the courts are going to give a fair amount of leeway. Some of the stuff is so established you can't play ostrich, like text messages it's well known. Social media, it's pretty well known. So some of these, if you make a mistake and don't collect in, there might be an adverse inference. There might be an assumption that you were choosing not to. But when you get to the more obscure stuff, it's evolving and there's a little grace there.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else have questions? Anything you're curious about? If not, I think, yeah. Well,
I've solved all the problems. Perfect.
as promised. Well, thank you all for joining us this afternoon and for, you know, the questions and the engagement. Kat, it's wonderful, as always, to hear you speak. Oh, we have one more question. Oh, Elaine says, joined late, but great presentation. So thank you all. As we mentioned, we'll circulate this deck along with Kat's and my contact information and Kat's white paper in the next few days here. And feel free to find us on LinkedIn in the meantime if you have any burning questions.
And I just want to jump in really quick and say thank you to you both for joining. This is a great presentation. To all of our members, I'll make sure to get all the materials that Sarah referenced. And if somehow you have missed any contact information, would be interested in contacting either Sarah or Kat, please feel free to let me know and I will get you in touch with them. Or screenshot this slide. All right, go ahead, Kat.
All right, thank you guys and appreciate it.
Thank you.